Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this month's webinar, Supplementing CLC with Authentic Latin Resources, presented by the North American Cambridge Classics Project and underwritten by Cambridge University Press. I'm Martha, and Jenny and I would like to welcome back Maureen. Maureen Lamb has been a frequent presenter of our webinars, and she's done a variety of topics, and she also is just a wonderful, wonderful presenter. We're just so delighted to have her this evening. And if you would like to go back and take a look at any of her previous webinars, they're all archived on our NACCP website, cambridgelatin.org/training. Maureen teaches at Kingswood Oxford School in West Hartford, Connecticut, and she is the language department chair there and also the academic technology coordinator. And she's also a certified Google trainer. So on that note, we welcome Maureen this evening. And please know that if any of you do need a certificate for this evening's webinar, I'll be happy to send that out to you if you just request one. So Maureen, let's talk about CLC and all these authentic Latin resources.
Yay, thank you so much. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. Now, one of the projects I've been working on is just basically going through and for every chapter, finding more authentic resources to supplement the Cambridge Latin course. There's already so many wonderful pictures and references, and I love the culture sections at the end of each chapter, because as we all know, you don't learn language in a vacuum. You learn language for the cultural and historical context of it. And to understand a language, truly understand a language, it's really important to understand the culture and the products of the culture that made that language. And so I know I don't have a tiny URL link tonight because I usually do, but that's because this is a work in progress. As soon as I have everything completed for this, I'm happy to share it. I'm happy to share the work in progress. If you'd like that, I'll put the link in the chat afterwards. So one of the questions I get a lot from people is, what are authentic resources for a language that is not spoken regularly? And I mean, that's a really fair question. But now, as I'm sure a lot of you realize, a lot of districts are moving to adopting the intercultural competency standards. And that's not only indicative of proficiency with the language, but really seeing proficiency with the language as just one piece of a larger mosaic of an interculturally competent student. In order for a student to have intercultural competency, they have to understand the history, the culture, what goes behind the language, how language was communicated, and what are resources from the language that are considered authentic. And again, this can be a little bit challenging with Latin because there are not a ton of authentic Latin speakers out there, or what we might term authentic. I don't really like that word, but I understand where people are coming from when they use it. So we're talking about ancient stuff here for the most part, ancient and medieval, when Latin was the lingua franca, when Latin was more widely used. Now, it's important to realize that these are not the language itself, while an amazing and important, and perhaps our most important resource. Latin language is not the only resource we have. We have a lot of archaeological sources as well. And those, in many cases, are authentic sources for understanding the culture of ancient Rome. So as we think about it not just the language, but also these archaeological sources as being kind of primary sources for what's going on in Rome. And again, how can students engage with authentic resources for a culture that no longer exists? Most of the CLC is focused on ancient Rome. And so we're talking about a culture that, while it did exist and we have evidence of its existence, we can't interact with it. We can't call someone from ancient Rome. We can't Skype with them. We can't have kind of a face-to-face interaction. So how do we have this communicative interaction with ancient Rome? Now, following the intercultural competency model, at the kind of the lowest level would be a comparison level. Like, how does my life compare to the life of someone in ancient Rome? How do my experiences compare to the experiences of people in ancient Rome? What products do I use in my everyday life that are compared to those in ancient Rome? And kind of building from that over time and looking at the differences. And while not judging them, but looking at them and seeing, okay, this is different because of this is different because of this is similar because of this, and making those comparisons, then students can have that cultural interaction. And this is a little global confidence model. So understanding and appreciating the perspectives and the worldviews of others. And this includes ancient people. It's not that the ancient world can't communicate with us. I think that by reading ancient texts and by looking at what is left behind by ancient peoples, by archaeological remains, we can tell quite a lot about what people valued and what people saw as important. When I was taking a graduate school class on archaeology, I remember the professor saying that if everyone went away and from our homes right now, and thousands of years on someone was to kind of take up our homes, they would think that we had some sort of shrine in the corner of our living room to this something that we all watched and worshiped, and it would be the TV. But you can tell a lot about a culture by how things are placed in a room, how things are used, and things like that, which is so interesting. And I just think it's pretty cool to think of it like that. Oh, I see something in the chat. Oh, cool. Okay. Motel of the Mysteries by Dave McCauley.
That's
Awesome.
right.
And then examine local, global, and intercultural issues. So what are some issues that the ancient Romans faced that we're still facing? They had issues with people who are enslaved. They had issues with the treatment of women. They had issues with the treatment of non-Romans. There's a lot of issues to unpack there that are still issues that we definitely have today. So it's things to think about. Engage in open, appropriate, and effective interactions across cultures. So while we're looking at things, making sure that we're kind of taking what we get from these cultures and really thinking about it and thinking about how it affected their culture, but also how can we compare it to what we're experiencing and how might it affect us? And also taking action for collective well-being and sustainable development. A little difficult, again, with Roman times because they don't exist anymore, but it doesn't mean we can't learn from this. I had an amazing Latin class one year who decided from what they learned about their experiences reading about Caesar and his soldiers, that they were going to collect items to send to troops overseas. And they were inspired by reading Julius Caesar, which was so cool. So it's not that you can't learn lessons from reading Latin that happened a long time ago about what you can do in the present time. So something to keep in mind. Oh, here's my first one. Now, as I tell my students, and I was so excited about this, I'm sure some of you watched Loki over the summer and watched the most amazing part of Loki. Tom Hiddleston, by the way, was a classics major, which is pretty awesome. But if someone tells you that classics isn't relevant and Latin's not relevant, take a look at this.
Free, my horn friends, be free! Mihi nomen est loci. Praefectus consilii ad tempus mutantem. Atque ad ferro acervum nuntium ad vos omnes. Vos omnes. Morituri estis. Iste mox. Ignes. Pastos per saecola in vos est. E vomiturus.
There we go. Okay. I bet a lot of you saw that over the summer, like I did, was very excited, but it was a great way to show my students, because when a lot of students come into Latin on the first day, they think, oh, I'm learning a dead language. I won't have to talk Latin. And that's so not true. You can absolutely speak in Latin, as many of us do. Some of us don't, and that's totally cool. But there are definitely a lot of opportunities for that. So I like to show that clip with Tom Hiddleston to my kids in the first day of Latin, because I like to say, hey, look, you could speak like Tom Hiddleston, and that's pretty cool, right? And so there are ways to communicate in Latin, even if it's a so-called dead language. Again, more like a zombie language, because so much of it influences us today. Okay, so stage one, looking at authentic resources right away. We have this wonderful bust of Caecilius to look at. And it's kind of cool because I think I asked my students to describe it. Do you think this is kind of a flattering portrait? Like, why would someone choose to represent themselves in this way? And I think he tried to look real. I think it's kind of the equivalent of taking an ancient Roman selfie or something. It's like, this is what I look like. And he even has a caption for his selfie there, describing what's going on. Also, something I like to bring up, everyone loves the dog. I think people get more sad about the dog dying than any other part of the Cambridge Latin course. So I think that bringing up right away the dog, and I have a lot of dog lovers in my class, they can relate because they have pets, and bringing up the Aquae Carmina mosaic. So they can do that right away. And right away, you can show them that, here, look, here is Latin in this mosaic. And here's a ferocious looking dog. And you can see right away, look, they have a beware of dog sign, just like people have today. Take a look at that. That's pretty cool. And so there's a lot of different directions you can go with this. So you can look at simple inscriptions from Pompeii. You can talk about Caecilius's role as the paterfamilias, like from the way he presents himself, from the caption on his statue selfie. And also, it might be a good opportunity to talk about Roman naming conventions, because you have this primary source right here, and then engaging with students about either their families, if they feel like sharing, or imagined families, or something I've been doing the last couple of years, taking their knowledge of mythology, because a lot of them come into Latin with a great deal of knowledge about the family tree of the gods and goddesses, and having them kind of describe the family tree in Latin, so that right away you're getting that authentic kind of engagement in the language, which is pretty cool. Now, I have slides for every single chapter, but we are not going to have time to go through every single chapter. So I'm going to pick and choose. And so if I skip your favorite chapter, I apologize. And if I don't have resources for your favorite chapter yet, you can reprimand me later and I will get those to you. Okay. So stage two, I do Roman.
Good evening.
I do a bunch of Roman house project things, and I've done a ton of different ones over the years. I've done the candy house. I've done the Lego house. I've done a bunch of different things. Yes, I can share it with you and send it to you. But the most fun we've had is we look at different rooms in the Roman house, but then what we do is we compare it to what life in the insula would be like. Because while the villa life is really cool and exciting, many ancient Romans would actually be living in insulae and would live in these apartments. And so I show students images of the insulae on the Capitoline, the insulae in Ostia, just to give them a sense of what kind of everyday Romans might live like. And so, it's going to start doing all of the things and making noise. Sorry, I'm trying to move on. Move on, no, go away. Sorry. And so thinking about, where do people live in Rome, and talk about the villa portrayed in the book, but also compare it to the life in the insula, and what would be the differences and similarities between them. And what would life be like living in a city in ancient Roman times? One of the things that my students are always kind of flabbergasted by is, if you live in a big house, you eat in. Whereas if you are someone who lives in insula, you're more likely to eat out, because you'd have to cook food over this little brazier. And so it's much more convenient to go out to a taberna and pick up food out. So you're more likely to get fast food if you're one of the people who are poorer, and you're more likely to eat at home if you are one of the wealthy people. And so that's always like, wait a minute, you don't get to eat out, but it would be very different. And so that's another cultural comparison to talk about. And then just thinking about kind of similarities and differences to how we live today. Are there apartments over shops? Yes. In fact, if you go down most streets in New York City, you see the shops on the bottom and you see the apartments on top. And it feels similar in a lot of ways, which is interesting. They may not have quite the same layout for big houses, but the apartments haven't changed a ton except for the indoor plumbing part. So it's really interesting to think about. For stage 3, I like to talk a lot about Eumakia. I love Emma Vanderpool's novella about Eumakia, but I also like to bring up the fact that she had a building, she had a statue dedicated to her. And I think it's really important from the get-go just to make sure that there are a lot of different voices represented. And so that's why I like to bring that up pretty quickly within the text, is talking about Eumakia and her building and talking about the forum and kind of the business that goes on in the forum. And so again, we talk about professions, and sometimes I pick out some very easy gravestones to use with students so that they can see kind of different professions. For example, there's a great one that has a medica on there, and I asked them what a medica is, and they eventually realized it's a doctor, and it is a female doctor, which is pretty cool because a lot of them wouldn't associate that with being something that's in ancient Rome. Or looking at the grave of a soldier and kind of figuring out, okay, how do we know that this is a soldier's grave? What information is included on here? And again, these are very novice students. So really, the skills they have for actual Latin right now are just picking out a couple of words, a couple of known words. We're talking novice low to maybe some novice mid here. But again, these are authentic sources where students can pick out enough words so that they can feel like, oh yeah, I understand this. This is what's going on here, which is pretty cool. Stage 4 is where I have students think about, okay, if people are going into the forum to do business, what exactly are they doing? And so thinking about conducting business. And so I actually have students set up taberna where they sell things, and we talk about it, and we look at what a taberna looks like, and we look at kind of how you put the products in front of you, and people come and they browse the merchandise, and then you have an exchange. I have about 300 fake gold Roman coins, and we practice our numbers by going back and forth, and bargaining for how many coins we're going to use for different items. I've had everything from bagels to stuffed animals to all sorts of things, but just kind of talking about how to negotiate business while looking at kind of what a taberna would look like and trying to physically recreate that a little bit, and having students have this authentic engagement with numbers where they're kind of passing it back and forth. Stage 5 is really cool. I love theater, I love acting, and I think it's really cool to go over that with students. I think that it can be a little hard because a lot of Roman plays are maybe not super appropriate at times. And so thinking about kind of what you can appropriately show students, kind of what level those students are at. Sometimes it's different if they're a middle school or a high school student, or even a college student if they're using Cambridge. And so thinking about what you want to tell students, and also talking about masks. And that's something that's a lot on people's minds these days, because we know what it's like to wear a mask, but these big masks that they would wear while they're performing, and how that would be to perform and speak in that. And so we like to watch either a scene or two from The Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, or The Boys from Syracuse, depending on what I can find on YouTube, and have students kind of see that. I like A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, just because it shows Rome is kind of dirty and kind of not totally pristine. And there's something I really like about that. And then we talk about different stereotypes. And I just saw something in the chat. This is similar to something that I do. I have them compare it to different stereotypes in different stock characters and sitcoms. And so one of the ones they love to pick is Friends, because for some reason, all of my students love to watch Friends. And so talking about the different characters that are portrayed there and how they might compare to the characters that are portrayed in ancient Rome. And are they stereotypes? Are they negative views? Are they positive views? It really just depends. And I have them look at different masks to try to see, okay, what are these different masks used for? Is this a comic mask? Is this a tragic mask? How do you think this was used? What kind of character do you think this mask might have been used for? In stage 6, we talk a lot about slavery and enslaved people, and also people who were freed and what their obligation would be to their patron once they were freed. And this can be a difficult topic, but it's something that I think is important and something that you can engage in with students. I also like to show the images of the Augustales, the freedmen who were kind of the priests of Augustus and had their like little priestly club here in Pompeii. It's pretty cool. And I think that it's interesting that they have this different place in society. It's kind of like in between. It's interesting. And also, if the students have a little more Latin, sometimes I take a break in between chapters at the beginning and read a novella with students. And if they have a little more Latin, then again, I can kind of look at some gravestones with them and think about people who have been freed people who were formerly enslaved people, and kind of what happens afterwards. Like what do they do afterwards? Do they change their name? Like how does it affect their lives, and how is that indicated on their gravestones? I find for me that gravestones are one of the most important resources when I'm going through things with students, because gravestones are very meaningful for people. Because when you have a gravestone in the ancient world, your gravestone is your whole life. It's symbolizing like, this is what my life was. And so I think it's extremely meaningful to look at that and to see what mattered and what this person valued, which is now on their gravestone. And so that's something I do with students often. Next, we talk about Cana, and my students always guess wrong. I say, oh, okay, so ancient Romans, you're having a dinner party. What are the ancient Romans going to eat? And always I get those answers, pizza and pasta. No, not pizza and pasta, because guess what? Pasta comes from China and tomatoes come from the New World. So you're not going to have your lovely marinara sauce. And so, no, they're not going to have pizza and pasta. And so we talk about food in the ancient world. And sometimes when I have a little more time, I have students look at recipes from Apicius. I have students make some recipes. Students really liked I think it was ham and cheese stuffed figs. They were not a big fan of the stuffed grape leaves, but we tried different things, and we had some experiments just to see. And we talk about how tastes change over time. Things that other cultures and other time periods might have found appealing, we may not find appealing. I actually bought garum this year to have some of the students try it. And while I liked it and a few other students liked it, and those were not a fan of garum as a condiment, they prefer ketchup. But it was interesting, and I had a lot of brave souls try garum, and it was pretty cool. It tasted like a really salty fish sauce, but that was kind of the taste that they enjoyed, and that was something there. And I love this mosaic of all the stuff on the ground after a big dinner party with the little mouse eating it. I just think this mosaic is so cool. And just seeing the leftovers of what's after the party and trying to figure out, I have my students try to figure out what they were eating at this dinner party. And so talking about different foods and tastes, and this is a great way also to interact in Latin. You can say, okay, what do you like? What do you prefer? What do you not like? And so that can be a really fun interaction too for a little community engagement as we talk about this kind of authentic resource here. Oh my gosh, this is a really fun documentary that I watch with the students. It's about the Colosseum, and I have a link to it there. But I also really love this different portrayal of different gladiators. And we talk about kind of what the different gladiators are doing, how their armor is different, and we learn about the different types of gladiators. And it's interesting because we also talk about kind of what kind of gladiator would you want to be if you had to be a gladiator? What kind of armor would you want to wear? What do you think would be the most effective way of fighting? And it's really interesting to hear people's reasoning behind it and to engage with students in that. And it's interesting to think about gladiatorial fights with kids because they're very brutal and there's a lot of violence. But I think that we do talk about too, how a lot of times my students are like, violence doesn't really matter to them I guess like matters to them, but like watching it on TV doesn't really affect them that much because I think they've watched a lot of violence on TV or played a lot of violent video games. And so it's interesting. It's almost like they're numb to it. And so talking about something like gladiators isn't quite as horrific to them as it was to me as a teenager. Like, I feel like there's a little bit of a disconnect there. It's like, no, you don't understand. They're going out and fighting each other. And of course, there's the theory that perhaps there's more of a WWE element to it with pigs' bladders full of blood under their armor and stuff like that. But still, at the same time, it's people fighting each other with swords. And there's an element of real violence there and imminent death. And that's something that's a little bit scary. But when you think about it, our kids are watching things like Squid Game and stuff like that, where there's a lot of violence and death. And so it may not affect them as much. It's an observation. And again, thinking about the different types of gladiators and what kind of gladiator you might want to be if you had to be a gladiator, or which do you think would be the most effective gladiator? Next, we talk about baths. And I always love talking about bathhouses because I think it's so interesting to see how students engage with this, because we have things sort of like this, but not quite like this. I always like to talk about the locker room and the apoditarium and everything like that, and then talk about the different rooms that they're going through and how you'd be like hanging out in a big hot tub with a bunch of your friends, or you'd be hanging out in the sauna. And it's really interesting because a lot of times people compare it to sports clubs or gyms. So you go and you work out and then you shower, but there's not really that kind of like communal shower atmosphere. It's more of a it's more private. But there are bathhouses even today in places like Turkey where it's very similar to this. I went to a Turkish bathhouse when I was in Turkey, and it felt very much like this. It was really interesting. It was a very different experience than, going to the spa or the health club or something. And so it's interesting. And also I like when we can look at the different pictures of the baths in Pompeii to just see how wealthy these people were and how intricately decorated these bathhouses were. And it's really cool to look at, and how much time and care was obviously put into them, even having the arched roofs so that the drips of sweat wouldn't fall on people's heads, things like that. Those little details, it made it very luxurious for people to use these bathhouses. And again, how is Roman bathing different from bathing today? And again, is it more similar to a gym experience? A lot of the takeaways there, we love to watch Magister Craft's bathhouse thing. And just the takeaway is, oh, here are people, they're working out, and then they go to the bathhouse. And so people go to the gym and they bathe. They just don't have this kind of communal bathing experience necessarily, unless they're swimming in a pool, in which case it is communal bathing, but it's not, we don't call it that. If people are swimming and they're in swim costumes, it's very different. For stage 10, we talk about speeches, and we talk about kind of what makes a persuasive speech. And so I pulled out here Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, because we talk about that. We talk about what makes that persuasive. We also talk about Mark Antony's speech from Julius Caesar by Shakespeare, kind of what makes that speech persuasive. Again, these are usually freshmen and sophomores in high school or middle schoolers. And so when they're thinking about this, they're noticing things like repetition. They're noticing things like stronger language, or doing things in threes. They're noticing these things. They might not have all the kind of word for it yet, but they're noticing the difference in what makes a good speech.
I have the pleasure to...
Okay. And so one of the things I like to do is have students give persuasive speeches on a topic in English. Just I thought, what would persuasive speaking sound like? And then have them watch speeches to see what makes a speech persuasive. This is something kind of fun for them to work on. Candidati, I love doing this one. I think this is such a fun stage, but also there's so much cool graffiti to go with this. And I just think it's really cool to look at all the different electoral graffiti and how a lot of it is sponsored by different guilds, different people, like the bread makers want this person to win, or the weavers want this person to support this person. And I think it's really interesting because in some ways it breaks down by occupation about who wants whom to win. And it makes you wonder, like, what are they supporting? Because it's not like a list of what all the people are supporting. It's more, these are the people who support them. So it's almost like you're voting with your friends who are supporting this person. And so thinking about that and comparing modern kind of election slogans, modern election ads, which is actually kind of fun in an election year, to graffiti from Pompeii, and really thinking about what are the similarities and differences. And another thing I like to point out is a lot of this graffiti is clearly geared towards elections, and only men could vote in ancient Rome. But some of the graffiti is written by professions that were largely done by women. And so even though women couldn't vote, they still had a say in what went on in elections, which is pretty cool, because if they are supporting a candidate and they're putting it out there, even if they're not voting, they're saying, hey, this is our voice, support us. And there's something really cool about that. And again, how are people expressing themselves? How are they representing themselves? We've actually done a graffiti wall before in my classroom, where I'll have a whiteboard and we will think about kind of different slogans you could put, appropriate slogans that you can put, but having people just write different things and kind of seeing what that's like and kind of responding to each other with the graffiti wall is kind of fun. Because you can see that too in the Pompeian graffiti. Like, you'll have one bit of graffiti here, and then you'll have kind of a graffiti type response underneath, either supporting it or detracting from it, just depending on where it is. And next we have Vesuvius, the one where the dog dies, and everyone else, but the dog is what makes everybody sad. I like to show a documentary usually at this time. And so this particular documentary, I like the catastrophe of Pompeii. Later on, when it's Claudius, I like to show Pompeii, The Last Day, which is the BBC documentary. Sometimes I switch them, just depending. But I think for something like this, it's really important for students to see what the eruption looked like, because I think it's really difficult in some ways to capture in words what that would have looked like, what that would have been like. And so trying to show a video to kind of say, hey, here's a resource. And I used to, back in the day, show video footage of Mount St. Helens eruption, because that was the kind of nearest to the Plinian eruption that we had. But now there's so many wonderful computer generated models of what the eruption of Mount Vesuvius would have been, that I like what we have now. But it's interesting because that's a way that students can kind of experience what that would have been like for the people. And again, a lot of times we talk about escaping from Pompeii and how could people have escaped? And every time I have students think of answers to this, like, how, if you weren't in Pompeii, how would you have escaped? And it's really, I mean, thinking about it and thinking about like, how would you escape in a natural disaster is something that's pretty important. Like, how would you escape from your house if there was a fire? How would you escape if there were a flood? What would you do? But thinking about it from like, how would you escape from Pompeii? There are limited options here. I mean, you can try to leave really early on. If you stay in your house, the house is going to collapse on you. If you do this, like, there's a lot of different options, but not a ton of good ones. And so talking that through and then kind of relating it to, do you have a plan if there's a natural disaster? Do you have to plan if something happens? Like, really relating it to something that might be useful can be really helpful for students. I know they're pretty excited though. We have a storm tomorrow, so they all have a snow day, but so they're happy about that one. But generally speaking, I think it's important to talk through those things and think about it. Next, we talk about in Britannia. And so we're going on to the next book, and we talk about the structure of houses in Britain and how they compare to the structure of houses that we've talked about earlier that we saw in Pompeii, and comparing that to the insulae, the Capitoline insulae, and also the insulae in Ostia, and thinking about how the structures themselves were different. In fact, I actually use this passage from Caesar where they're being attacked by the Gauls, but they have Gallic style housing. And they talk about how the Romans have adapted this Gallic style housing with the wattle and daub and the straw roofs. But because of that, the Gauls are able to kind of burn the roof off their houses and make it so that it's not going so well for poor Cicero and his camp here in Caesar Book 5. And so while students may not know all the words here, I can at least kind of go through it with them and show them kind of like why this would have been different than Roman housing. And again, this is an extreme example where these houses are under attack, but the straw roofs made it so that it was easier for them to be attacked by burning missiles and stuff like that. So that's something to keep in mind. Next, we're going to talk about Apud Salium. And there's a lot to unpack here, but one of the things I like to do with my students is look at Roman hairstyles and look at different Roman hairstyles. And because it talks about her ornatrices in this chapter. And so thinking about like, what were the different Roman hairstyles? How did hairstyles change over time? How have our hairstyles changed over time? How have like the popular hairstyles changed over time? I think even back to the 80s, like the hair was a little bit different then. And what has changed between then and now as to kind of like what hairstyles are in style. And it could be a wide range, but even looking at kind of the Roman statues, there's a wide range of popular hairdos as well. And it makes for some really interesting conversations. And also I have had in the past some students who are interested in doing their hair in kind of a Roman style, which is cool. And we have I put a video in there about Roman hairstyles, which is pretty cool. And then there's an actual how-to video, which I found really interesting. Oh, they can do the Rachel. Yes, exactly. I love that comment. That's awesome. Yeah, because that was so in the 90s. I had a lot of friends who had the Rachel. It was a cool hairstyle. I mean, it's still a cool hairstyle, but yeah, it's funny to think about what was popular. And so if people want to try the hairstyle, we can do this. If they want to kind of just talk about it and again, compare it to our lives, how have styles changed over the past, for me, the last 37 years, how have things changed? And so it's interesting and kind of fun to talk about and have students relate it to their lives. Next, we've got Rex Coby Dubnus, and I love to talk about Fishbourne Palace and the fact that we're not like super sure who lived there, which is interesting. And oh, I love that idea. Someone wrote in the chat, produce some images of American styles and see if they can date them. I love that. That's such a good idea. Yeah. That's fantastic. And so thinking about Rex Coby Dubnus, thinking about, did he really live in Fishbourne Palace? What was Fishbourne Palace? Was it British? Was it Roman? What was it? It's so wonderfully mysterious. And just kind of talking about how ornate the decoration is and so I like to show a video where students can kind of go through the palace and take a look at it. Just so they can kind of see what it looks like inside and kind of brainstorm who might have lived there. I know in the Cambridge series, we say it's King Coby Dubnus, but we're not really sure who lived there. It's someone important, clearly. Was it an emperor? Was it a governor? Who lived there? Was it Roman? Was it British? It's very cool. And it's a fun mystery to try to solve. And do we know the answer? No. So it makes speculation even that much more fun. In Aula. So in Aula, I like to talk about the gardens that are around Fishbourne Palace, but also talk about some of the plant life they found in Pompeii and all the cool things they're doing with it right now, because they've been able to identify seeds, carbonized seeds and things like that in and around Pompeii. And they were also able to find kind of like carbonized seeds for the different grapes that were grown around Pompeii. And so it's really cool to think about kind of recreating the past by planting the same things in that area. And so that's something that's really interesting to talk about and to think about with students and kind of what people would plant. And the fact that the Romans they loved plants. And so even if you lived in the city, there were often kind of window box gardens, and there was a lot of green life in ancient Rome. A lot of people had gardens. If you had lived in an insula, there might be a garden at the bottom. If there was a light well, having that garden at the bottom of the insula. So people to use, kind of like an ancient community garden where people could grow things maybe. And so it's interesting to think about all the growing things and what people could grow, and look at that. So that's a really cool authentic research, and they're learning more and more over time. So it's something you can keep looking into. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about Alexandria. I love doing this with students. I love talking about the pharaohs. I love talking about the 7 wonders of the world. And we actually do a really cool project called the 7. I'm happy to share this too if people are interested, called the 7 Wonders of the World project. And we use Orbis, which I think is from I think it's UMichigan. Is it UMichigan or Stanford? I don't remember, but it's this wonderful map that you can map out places from one part of the ancient world to another. And so what I have students do is they pretend to be they pretend to be travel agents, and they're trying to advertise trips to different wonders of the world. And it's pretty cool. Oh, Katie says we're doing selfies at the 7 right now. They have to create social media posts as if they're at the wonders. I love that. That's awesome. That's really cool. That's a really cool idea. I might try that. I've really liked doing the brochure too with students, because then they have to figure out how far the 7 wonders are from Rome, and also kind of how much money it would take to get there, how they would travel. Are they traveling over land? Are they taking a boat? How are they traveling? And so they have to really think through the journey as a travel agent, which is kind of cool actually. And so how would an ancient Roman travel agent advertise this? And we also, I know it's not grammar focused, but we use the subjunctive. Let us go to Alexandria, or let us go to wherever. It's fun. And it's a cool way for students to do that and engage with authentic resources, because they can only use either pictures of the monument or ancient pictures and depictions of the monument. So that's pretty fun for them as well. And I love the authentic, like how long it actually takes to get there and what resources they would need to visit there. So that would be cool. And of course, for Eutychus and Clemens, like so many do, I'm sure, we love to learn about glass and glass in the ancient world. And so watching a video about glass blowing, my middle school actually had a Zoom call with someone who did glass blowing, which is so cool. And hopefully maybe we visit glass blowers at some point. I think it's really neat to see kind of this ancient art that's so interesting. Oh, I see something in the chat. Ooh, season 2 of Blown Away on Netflix. They had to make a perfume bottle in one episode. Talked about the ancient Egyptian perfume bottles. Oh my gosh, that is so cool. A glass blowing reality show? What? Oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to check that out. That's amazing. What a great idea. Oh my gosh, my students would love that. That would be so cool. Thank you for sharing that. Ooh, I'm gonna have to put a link to that in here if I can find it. That's awesome. And again, another thing to think about how were cats sacred to the Egyptians, because that comes in too, and talking about, sometimes it's upsetting to students to talk about mummified cats, so we kind of gloss over it. But other times students are really interested in kind of which animals the Egyptians would mummify and why these particular animals were sacred to the ancient Egyptians. So reading the class, just trying to figure out kind of what they want to know more about and what would be interesting to them. And so that's something that I like to talk about, and just talk about, are there other sacred animals? Let's talk about other sacred animals. There's the sacred geese of Juno, talking about even modern sacred animals, what animals are sacred to different cultures. And so it's interesting to make those comparisons and to think about it, and to think about the sacredness too. And how does that compare to our, we have also endangered animals, like animals we need to keep safe. And so kind of taking it and going a little further with it is fun. Next, I love to bring up the Temple of Isis when we're going through Isis in Pompeii, and talk about how the influence of Isis spread as far away as Pompeii. There's also a really interesting inscription. So depending on kind of the level of my students, we'll explore this inscription in the Temple of Isis as well. But it's just interesting that to see kind of the influence over time. And I love doing it here, because then when we get to Minerva Sulis, we can talk about that too. We can talk about, okay, there's a little bit of kind of religious overlap here. And also talking about Serapis too, and kind of where the god Serapis came from. What were the influences for the god Serapis? And again, how is that related to later on when we're going to go over Minerva Sulis and talking about that, and kind of the idea of religious syncretism, like the Romans going into a place and taking the religion, respecting the religion, but kind of applying the Romanists to that religion as they're doing it, which is always very interesting how it grows over time. Medicus, it really, again, depends on the level, but we can show the grave of the Medica or other Medicuses. We can talk about different tools that the ancient Romans had. There are a lot of different tools that look like modern tools, like the scalpel and the saw. They look like the modern surgeon tools that we have. Not as shiny, that's for sure, but it looks like they're similar. And it's really interesting to know that the ancient Romans had that type of sophistication with their surgical tools in a way that wasn't seen again for a long time after Rome fell, which is so interesting. And thinking about what the differences and the similarities are. And so then we're going to talk about Aquae Sulis. And again, like we were talking about, and how do the baths in Aquae Sulis compare to the baths in Pompeii? And what we were just talking about, how is the worship of Minerva Sulis different to the worship of Isis in Pompeii and Serapis? So talking about all of those things. Oh, thank you, Matthew. Matthew shared that the CLC Unit 2 activity book has a lot of great worksheets and handouts for stage 2 with ties to modern medicine. That's really cool. I love to show pictures to students and have them try to figure out what it is too. So that can be kind of a fun thing to do, but I think that's great that it's in the activity book. I think I'm going to skip ahead because Defixio we do something pretty cool with Defixio. I'm going to skip ahead a couple, but I'm going to talk about Defixio quickly, and then we'll go to Agricola and Milites. So with so what I was saying is the thing that we do that's cool with Defixio is I actually tell the story of, I know many of you probably know this, but Tolkien had a classics background. And so he actually was part of someone who found they found some sort of tablet where someone was cursing someone for stealing their ring. And then they also found the ring. And so I always have my students kind of read a little story I wrote in Latin about that, because I think it's really cool that not only did they find the ring, but they found like the curse tablet for the person who had stolen that ring in England, which is pretty cool. And some people think that that's what influenced Tolkien when he created the rings in Lord of the Rings, which is pretty neat. This idea of kind of this ring of power, this cursed ring that brings destruction upon the wearer. So it's interesting. We also, we just did this in one of my classes. We looked at the lives of Roman soldiers, and there are so many great videos out there. There's a really cool TED Talk out there. The Vindolanda Museum has a really great video about life of a Roman soldier, but also my students really think it's interesting to compare kind of ancient soldiers to modern soldiers, kind of what their duties are, how they would perform, like what different things did they have to do. And I think the thing that was most interesting to my students is like, wait a minute, they're not just soldiers, they're doing other things. They're building roads. They have all these kind of special skills that they get. They're trumpeters, they dig latrines, they cook the food. They have to do all these different things. And so thinking about being a soldier is not just someone who's fighting, but someone who's building roads, making the transportation system, but also having all these other kind of little specialized jobs as well. And so thinking about it, and also thinking about how warfare has changed. The idea that warfare used to be this kind of hand-to-hand combat. It was people fighting people they could actually see, whereas now warfare is so different with things like drone warfare and things like the anonymity of warfare. Like you can just drop a big something or other and you don't know who you're affecting by that. So it can be a little bit dark to talk about that, but it's interesting. Pamela shares that with Defixio, I bring in pieces of aluminum and a nail and have them make their own curse tablets. They get to fold them and nail them into the bulletin board. I used to do something very similar, but I had a few students who had religious objections to that. And so that was one of the reasons why I stopped doing that. I had them choose to, if they wanted to do kind of cursed tablets or just kind of like blessing tablets at another time, like if they wanted to do something like a gratitude tablet. And this time when we did milites, I had students make shots for slingshots. And what I did was I got a bunch of wooden eggs and had students write things because we're reviewing the imperative, getting ready for our indirect commands next chapter. And we were writing imperative things that were having to do with Valentine's Day because we did it around Valentine's Day. And then they were giving their shots to people. It was really cute. They were having fun with that. Oh, I like this. The rule is they cannot curse a real person, living or dead, only fictional characters. Yeah. The only thing with the wooden shots is I got the wooden eggs and they were like juggling them at first, but they got the hang of it. But it was really interesting for them to think that in ancient Rome, when you had slingshots, I actually did this because in chapter 26, they're in 25, they're talking a little bit about inscriptions. And so I thought it was really interesting that some of the slingshots that had appropriate things were actually quite readable by my students. And so I thought that was a really fun way to have tiny inscriptions that students could read that were comprehensible to them. I know I'm coming up on time, so I'm going to kind of just pick a couple more to jump into here. Let me see. Okay. And so this is an interesting chapter, and I like to bring up different philosophers and kind of think about what different philosophers in ancient Greece had their philosophies, and then compare it to Stoicism and have students think about the differences between Stoicism and Epicureanism and what do they think. And usually it's funny, I don't think I have a lot of students who do one or the other. I think everyone feels like they're kind of a mix of Stoicism and Epicureanism. There's not kind of this, I don't have a lot of Epicures, I guess, among my students, but it's just interesting that there's this kind of balance. And it makes you wonder, like, no one's just one way or the other way, but talking about it with them makes it really fun. And another thing I like to do is I like to bring up Hypatia of Alexandria. I know she's a scientist, but she's also kind of this ancient thought leader. And I love to I think Euphrosyne is a really cool character. And I think that kind of comparing okay, this is another woman who had a lot of influence here over the men of Alexandria, who she was teaching as a scientist, which is pretty cool. And oh yeah. And yes, thank you so much, Pamela, for saying Epictetus is a great example of a Stoic philosopher, freed slave. Yes. And yes, there are good movie clips with Hypatia from the movie Agricola with Rachel Weisz. That's right. And I believe the book talks about Epictetus too, right? I think so. Yeah, in the book. So I try to go over other things, but that's awesome. Okay, just a couple more. I know I only have a couple of minutes. So pantomimus, we talk about entertainment. What do people do for fun in ancient Rome? And how is it different from what people do for fun now? I know that a lot of my students are, oh, I watch my computer, or I do this. There used to be a lot more of, I go bowling, but pandemic. What are you going to do? And so it's interesting to think about kind of the things that we find entertaining and how they compare to the things that they found entertaining in ancient Rome, and just thinking about that. And so also we think about the royal palace of Domitian and where it's located, how it's decorated, and why it's prime location. So he's sitting there in his palace and he's overlooking the Circus Maximus. How awesome is that? You get to just go out there and watch your favorite races. It's like having your house way up against Gillette Stadium. I'm sorry, New England. So I don't know. whatever team you root for, having your house right there. My cousin used to have an apartment that was right above Wrigley Field. It was so cool. He could watch Cubs games from his balcony. But that's what I felt like he was a Roman emperor when he had that, because he could do his favorite activity from his house. So that's pretty cool. So thinking about how location matters there and how sumptuously it's decorated, and thinking how would you feel if you walked in and saw a house decorated like this? How have tastes changed? And of course I get the kids who watch HGTV and say, oh, well, this and this and this are in style, or white kitchens or whatever it is. But it's so interesting the way things change and kind of making those comparisons, which is cool. Let's see, I probably have enough time for a couple more. Let me jump in. I'm going to jump here. Oh, this is one of my favorites. Murder in Rome is such a fun documentary to show when you're doing the court scene. And my students, they were so blown away. I was at NECTFL 2 weeks ago, and I showed this while I was at NECTFL, and I came back and my students said, "This is the best movie I've ever seen in school. Cui bono." And I said, "Oh, wow, I was not expecting this. You love this."
Wow.
And so it was really cool for them to see kind of Cicero, young Cicero in his element. Of course, we're reading in Catalinum now, and they're just like, they love it so much more because of the characterization of Cicero in this documentary. They think Cicero's cool. So we're just not going to tell them anything otherwise. And so it's been pretty cool to see that. And so again, when I do this, I do a little bit in Catalinum. I do the first, 12 chapters, and then talk about the difference between ancient and modern trials and how things worked differently, bribing juries, all that good stuff, kind of the showmanship involved that was a little bit different, a little more dramatic, things like that. We also talk about donatio memoriae and what exactly that means, and also comparing that to the Athenian practice of ostracization. And I show them some ostraca pictures from ancient Athens so they can see that even the people who were, Alcibiades and Pericles, like the big ones, they had ostragon that would say their names. So it really didn't matter. And then we talk about like, okay, what if we did ostracization now? What would that look like? And so it makes for very interesting conversations with the kids. Oh, cool. Pamela says, with pantomimus, I show them videos of Bharatanatyam, classical dance of India. One dancer tells a whole story with gestures, expression, and rhythm. Oh, very cool. That's neat.
Great idea.
That's really cool. I used to do Balinese dance in college, and that was very similar. Like every movement meant something. That would be very cool. Great idea.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm definitely out of time because I only have 3 minutes, but I also like to talk about the Wigglies. I think that's really important, talking about how they are firemen and they're police, they're firefighters, they're police officers, all kind of rolled into one, and what they do. How do they compare to different modern occupations? I also, when we read Carmina, I love to bring in Sulpicia here, and also the anonymous poet from Pompeii. I think those are really cool those are some really cool poems to bring in and do some really interesting comparisons to Catullus. And later on, I love to bring in Sappho, of course, and do some Sapphic comparisons, because I think that's really neat. Then we have divorce stuff. We have a lot of things. Oh, and just a last thing. I love to bring in, we talk about the Aeneid even before we read it, because I like to kind of spiral it up from the beginning. Like, we're going to read this thing called the Aeneid up in advanced Latin, AP Latin. So this is how we do it. And talking about kind of why and how Daedalus is referred to in the Aeneid in book 6 and lines 14 to 41 there. And also there's this really cool picture that I found of Icarus on an Etruscan bulla. And so what would it mean to give your child a bulla with a picture of Icarus on it? Are you trying to make them not like Icarus? Like, what exactly does that mean? And have students try to interpret that. So there's a lot of cool things there. Like I said, I didn't have time to go over everything, but I just wanted to talk about just some of the ways that I like to engage with authentic resources so that I can help make my students more interculturally competent and really have a good sense of Roman culture, history, and how to connect that with them. So that's it for tonight. I'm happy to share this with you. And again, it's a work in progress. I'm still adding more things. If you have ideas and you want to share them with me, I'm happy to add it all to the slideshow when I share it. So that'd be great. And I'm just going to I'm going to go way back up to the beginning, a very good place to start, because if I go back to the beginning, then you can see my email. So you can feel free to email me for the copy of this. All right. Okay.
Thank you very much, Maureen. So many
My
excellent
pleasure.
ideas, and I loved how you went chronologically by stage for all of those teachers out there who primarily are focused on units 1 and 2, but yet you've got it for all 4 units. Really, really well done. Thank you so much.
Thank you.